must read the signs. We must read the signs. We must read the signs. We gotta read the signs.
Vi har samlats här idag för att lyssna på en av pionjärerna bakom 11 september sanningsrörelse, filosofi- och teologiprofessorn David Ray Griffin. Rörelsen, som tog form ett par år efter händelserna den 11 september, har idag förgrenats utan att förlora sitt mål, nämligen kravet på en ny, opartisk utredning av det som hände den dagen. De grupper som rörelsen består av, och här vill jag referera till en artikel som kom ut i Dagens Nyheter idag av Torbjörn Elensky, där han pratar om amatörforskare som spottar ut konspirationsteorier på löpande band. Men den här rörelsen, den omfattar nämligen piloter, brandmän, vetenskapsmän, religiösa och politiska ledare, ingenjörer och arkitekter, läkare och advokater med flera. Medlemmarna räknas idag i tusental. Och det krävs mycket mod att gå med i en sådan grupp. För det kan påverka ens karriär och ens trovärdighet i samhället. Så är det inte konstigt att många eller flertalet av de anslutna till de olika grupperna inom sanningsrörelsen är pensionerade. Eller åtminstone inte beroende av staten för sitt uppehälle. I många fall handlar det om avhoppare, folk inom CIA, FBI eller till och med det militära etablissemanget som fått nog av lögner och sadlat om. Det som kanske förvånar en del är frånvaron av journalister från dessa grupper. Men egentligen borde detta inte förvåna någon. För dagens journalister får inte verka utanför ramarna för det som tillåts sägas av etablissemanget. Och etablissemanget har bestämt sig för att inte rota djupare i dessa händelser, utan fortsätta som förr. Business as usual, med andra ord. Så trots idiotförklaringar, mörkläggningar och den mediala tystnaden har sanningsrörelsen vuxit sig allt större. Inte bara genom antalet medlemmar, utan främst genom sin förmåga att analysera och argumentera för sin sak. Experter inom olika områden har inte låtit sig tystas utan bjudit på strid. Senast är kemiprofessorn vid Köpenhamns universitet, Niels Harrit, som intervjuades av danska TV-nyheter, fjäder i hatten för danskarna, och presenterade sin omfattande studie om förekomsten av sprängämnen i dammet från de 2 tornen och byggnad nummer 7. Alltså de 3 byggnader som pulveriserades inom några sekunder av 2 plan. Detta genombrott inom forskningen på allra högsta nivå kommer att betyda mycket för sanningsrörelsen. Men den kommer även att leda till ännu fräckare attacker från mainstream media. Vi får inte göra oss några inbildningar. Det är ett stort dilemma. För ju starkare sanningsrörelsen blir, desto större är risken för nya attentat. Som då kommer att se till att vi förlorar alla våra civila och mänskliga rättigheter och fogar oss i en tilltänkt polisstat utan motstycke i historien. Det är alltså mycket som står på spel. Men man får aldrig kompromissa om sanningen. För det skulle leda till att våra barn och barnbarn aldrig får uppleva den frihet som vi kämpat för i så många år. 11 september handlar om mycket mer än ett ouppklarat och illa utrett brott. 11 september handlar om att återupprätta vår tro i den vetenskap och den empirism som är resultatet av så många civilisationers möten och ansträngningar. Västerlandet har nu i hundratals år nästan skrutit om just sin vetenskapliga och empiriska läggning. och försökt sprida den med alla medel till alla jordens hörn. Både på gott och ont. Men idag ser vi samma västerland titta bort och vägra tro sina ögon. Allt för att få behålla status quo. Allt för att inte gå miste om några smulor kanske från de mäktiga skor. En sådan mentalitet tillhör den mörka tiden då man brände vetenskapsmän på bål för att de vågade se bortom horisonten. Och det är just den sortens mentalitet som idag frodas och bejakas av makthavarna och deras media. Bevisen att allting inte gick till så som man fick det berättat för sig är överväldigande. De är så många att David Ray Griffin redan har skrivit 7 böcker i ämnet och planerar 2 nya. Han har inte, som Elensky skriver i Dagens Nyheter idag, ägnat sig åt suggestioner, utan han har samlat på fakta. Så en ny opartisk utredning är allt vi kräver. Vi ska inte hoppa till slutsatser. Vi vet ingenting, vem, var, hur. Vi vill ha en ny opartisk utredning. Och den har vi rätt till, med tanke på de inkonsekvenser och felaktigheter som belamrar den gamla. Innan jag lämnar ordet till professor Griffin vill jag citera en annan vetenskapsmans ord. Niels Harrit, expert på nanokemi och sprängämnen, som vågade det som många ännu inte vågat göra. Han skriver i sin artikel som nyligen publicerats på Newsmail följande, citerar: Vi i västvärlden älskar att prata om att exportera demokrati. Men är den värd att exportera om dess institutioner inte kan hantera 9/11? Å andra sidan, om vi kan anta utmaningen att återutreda händelserna den 11 september i en fri och öppen process, råder det ingen tvekan om att våra demokratiska institutioner kommer att stärkas av detta. Om vi vill stoppa kriget mot terrorismen finns det inget annat sätt. Är 9/11 en vägspärr eller en genväg till fred? Poängen här är 9/11 är en möjlighet, och jag citerar fortfarande Niels Harrit, en unik chans att vända om, kanske rent av den sista. Den faktiska situationen är så uppenbar, så kristallklar, att det enda hindret mot en öppen och oberoende undersökning är att bryta igenom pressens mainstreams barriär. Det verkar enkelt, men det är det inte. Ingen vill lyssna. Våra demokratiska institutioner måste återupprättas mycket snart. Varje fredsälskande person borde därför kräva en internationell och öppen utredning av 9/11. Utan sanning kan vi inte uppnå fred. Och Niels Harrit avslutar sitt inlägg med orden: 9/11 är nyckeln. Tack för mig.
Good evening. I have not been to Stockholm since 1965. I'm very happy to be back. Before I begin, I want to make 3 comments. One is I will, recognizing that English for most of you is a second or third language, I will try to speak slowly and clearly. Second, the young man videotaping this warned me that in the middle he's going to need to change the tape. So when you see him going like this, he's telling me to shut up for a minute and while he changes the tape. And thirdly, I'm just curious, how many of you came tonight because you saw Mr. Alinsky's article in DN? That's great. We had to move to the bigger room because of Mr. Alinsky. With enemies like that, who needs friends? My lecture is called 9/11 Time for a Second Look. In suggesting that it is time for people to take a second look at 9/11, I primarily have in mind people who decided long ago that the attacks of 9/11 happened essentially the way the Bush-Cheney administration and the official reports said they happened. Believing this, these people therefore decided that the so-called 9/11 Truth Movement, which disputes that official account, is comprised of crazy conspiracy theorists with no capacity to evaluate evidence objectively. Having formed these views long ago, such people, including most journalists, have been impervious to any arguments presented by the Truth Movement. They simply roll their eyes and move on. However, both the Truth Movement and the available evidence have changed dramatically in the past 3 years. Because of these changes, it is not rational to reject the claims of the movement out of hand without taking a second look. If you are a person who has had such an attitude, you cannot, in the face of these changes, simply roll your eyes without exhibiting the very irrationality of which you may charge members of the Truth Movement whom you dismiss as conspiracy theorists. My lecture is also addressed, albeit indirectly, to fellow members of the 9/11 Truth Movement. Some members have decided that now that Bush and Cheney are out of office and the Obama administration has reversed some of their 9/11-based policies, that getting the truth about 9/11 revealed is no longer so important. Other members of the movement, seeing that the Obama administration is still presupposing that Al-Qaeda attacked America on 9/11, have concluded that there is no hope that the truth will ever be revealed, so that we might as well give up. To such people, I suggest that getting the truth revealed is just as important as ever, because many 9/11-based policies, such as the war in Afghanistan, have not been reversed. I also suggest that because of changes in the political landscape, combined with developments in the 9/11 Truth Movement, we now have, really for the first time, a realistic chance of getting a true investigation. I turn now to my topic: why official conspiracy theorists should take a second look at 9/11. I use the name official conspiracy theorists advisedly. Quite often, people who believe the official theory about 9/11 speak contemptuously of members of the Truth Movement as conspiracy theorists. But this is irrational. A conspiracy occurs whenever two or more people plan in secret to do something illegal, such as rob a bank or defraud a corporation's investors. To hold a conspiracy theory about some event is simply to believe that that event came about as a result of such a secret plan. According to the Bush-Cheney interpretation of 9/11, which became the official account, the attacks of 9/11 resulted from a conspiracy between Osama bin Laden and 19 members of Al-Qaeda. This official account is therefore a conspiracy theory. It was the original conspiracy theory about 9/11. What this means is that everyone holds a conspiracy theory about 9/11. The debate about 9/11 is therefore not a debate between conspiracy theorists and people who reject conspiracy theories. It is simply a debate between those who accept the Bush-Cheney conspiracy theory and those who accept the alternative theory, according to which the attacks resulted from a conspiracy within the Bush-Cheney administration. Those who believe the official conspiracy theory, therefore, cannot rationally reject the alternative theory on the grounds that it is a conspiracy theory. To be rational, they must ask, which conspiracy theory is better supported by the relevant evidence? And once people are willing to ask that question, and then to look open-mindedly at all the relevant evidence, the game is really over. Because all of the evidence that supports the official theory falls apart under scrutiny. The only evidence that stands is evidence that supports the alternative theory, and it continues to grow. Let me make clear that I do not use the term official conspiracy theory as a term of reproach. There's nothing wrong with believing the official conspiracy theory. I myself believed it for the first year and a half before I had looked at the evidence. The only problem is if you are a true believer, meaning you are so convinced that the Bush-Cheney conspiracy theory is true that you cannot look open-mindedly at evidence that might contradict it. One reason why it is irrational to keep believing the Bush-Cheney conspiracy theory without being willing to look at new evidence is that there are now grounds for being skeptical of that theory that did not exist at the time that this theory became imprinted on most minds. At that time, for example, it was not known that the Bush-Cheney administration would tell enormous lies that would lead to millions of deaths, including thousands of American deaths. But we now know this. Besides the lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the White House after 9/11 ordered the Environmental Protection Agency to lie about the air at Ground Zero, at the World Trade Center site, to tell the people the air was safe to breathe, even though it was known that the air was full of asbestos and many other cancer-causing and lung disease-causing particles. As a result, about 60% of the some 40,000 workers who worked on the cleanup and rescue operations are now ill, if they have not died already. And the number of those who will die from these illnesses will probably exceed the number of people who died on 9/11 itself. These people were murdered with a lie. In the face of this information, it would be difficult to claim that the Bush-Cheney administration would have been morally incapable of orchestrating 9/11 and its cover-up. Now let me add, I realize that for this audience I probably didn't need to make that point. But in America, there are still many people who believe that the Bush-Cheney administration was so moral they would have never done such a heinous thing. We also now have reasons, not widely known at the time, to be skeptical of the official reports. Most people have assumed that the 9/11 Commission was run by its co-chairman, former Republican Governor Thomas Kean and former Democratic Congressman Lee Hamilton. They have thought of it, therefore, as an independent, non-partisan, impartial commission. But the 9/11 Commission was actually run by Philip Zelikow. He controlled the 85-person staff who did all the research. And he was in charge of writing the 9/11 Commission report. And who was Philip Zelikow? Well, he was essentially a member of the Bush-Cheney White House. he had worked with Condoleezza Rice in the National Security Council for the first President Bush. Then when the Republicans were out of office during the Clinton years, Zelikow and Rice wrote a book together. Then she brought him back to help with the transition to the new National Security Council when she was appointed National Security Advisor for the second President Bush. Thanks to a book about the 9/11 Commission by New York Times reporter Philip Sheehan, we now know that Zelikow, in spite of promises to the contrary, remained in contact with Rice while the report was being prepared, and also remained in contact with Karl Rove, the ultimate political operator in the Bush White House, who was intensely worried that the 9/11 Commission might say something damaging to their re-election hopes. Furthermore, Sheehan revealed that before Zelikow's staff had even held its first meeting, before they had started any research, Zelikow had written an outline of the 9/11 Commission report, complete with chapter headings, subheadings, and sub-subheadings. Sheehan also revealed that Kane and Hamilton conspired with Zelikow to keep the existence of this outline a secret from their staff. In a book they wrote about the 9/11 Commission, Kane and Hamilton criticized conspiracy theorists because rather than forming their theories on the basis of facts, they start with their theories and then look for facts or even fabricate facts to back them up. By contrast, Kane and Hamilton claimed the 9/11 Commission started with the facts, not with a conclusion. We were not setting out to advocate one theory or interpretation of 9/11 versus another, they claimed. And yet, they admitted, Zelikow assigned the subject of Al-Qaeda to one of the staff's teams, which was told to tell the story of Al-Qaeda's most successful operation, the 9/11 attacks. If that was not starting with a conclusion, what would be? If the 9/11 Commission was not independent of the Bush-Cheney White House, what about NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which prepared the reports on the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings? NIST is an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Therefore, during all the years that NIST was preparing its reports, it was an agency of the Bush-Cheney administration, run by an appointee of that administration. Recently, furthermore, a former employee of this agency has spoken out, saying that NIST had been fully hijacked from the scientific into the political realm. Scientists working for NIST, he says, lost their scientific independence and became little more than hired guns. Everything that came from the hired guns was routinely filtered through the front office of the Commerce Department and addressed for political implications before release. Moreover, he said, NIST reports on the World Trade Center also had to be approved by the National Security Agency and the Office of Management and Budget, an arm of the Executive Office of the President, which had a policy person specifically delegated to provide oversight on our work. As a result, NIST reports on the World Trade Center, which claimed that the buildings came down without the aid of explosives, are political, not scientific documents, as any serious examination of these reports would reveal. These scientists, with their PhDs in physics and engineering, could not possibly believe the things they have written in these reports. If reasons to take a second look at 9/11 are provided by new information about the Bush-Cheney administration and the official reports supporting its conspiracy theory, the same is true of the new shape of the 9/11 truth movement. At one time, it was dismissed as a bunch of kids on the internet. Then, after I joined the movement by publishing the New Pearl Harbor in 2004, it was dismissed as a bunch of kids on the internet plus an aging theologian. I appreciate any laughter. It gives me a chance to get a drink. So just feel free. Or applause. Either one works. George Monbiot, writing in The Guardian, referred to members of the movement as morons and idiots. Alexander Cockburn, writing in Counterpunch, The Nation, and Le Monde Diplomatique, referred to the members of the movement as the 9/11 conspiracy nuts, saying that they know nothing about the real world, especially the world of military affairs. Lacking any conception of evidence, Cockburn added, they represent the ascendancy of magic over common sense and reason. Insofar as critics of the movement, ignoring the fact that its early leaders included a pilot, a former police officer, a political economist of world-class stature, and a historian, could portray me as its head. Monbiot referred to me as its high priest. Another left-wing critic called me its guru. They could somewhat plausibly portray it as a religious movement, comprised of people who know nothing about the real world. As one critic put it, Griffin, being a theologian, is not qualified to talk about anything except myths and fairy tales. I did reply that if that's true, I should be eminently qualified to talk about the official conspiracy theory. Nevertheless, the 9/11 Truth Movement can easily be dismissed insofar as people retain an image of it that was formed several years ago, when it could be portrayed as led by people who have no expertise in the relevant fields. Even if that caricature, like most caricatures, contained a grain of truth then, it is now completely false. The intellectual leadership of the 9/11 Truth Movement is now exercised by scientists and other professionals who definitely know something about the real world. Many of these professionals have formed organizations dedicated to discovering and publicizing the truth about 9/11. Now, if you have pen and paper, let me suggest you may want to take down the names of some of these, because I'm hoping that some of you would be ones who might join these organizations, or that you might have friends who would be candidates to join these. And one reason I'm lecturing throughout Europe is to try to build up the number of people who belong to these organizations, which have petitions calling on President Obama to authorize a new investigation. So the bigger these organizations are, obviously, the more force they will have. A few years ago, some scientists formed SPINE, the Scientific Panel for the Investigation of 9/11. Other scientists more recently formed Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. And all of these you can find just by going on Google by the title of the organization. This one is Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. The main work of which has been carried out by physicists and chemists. Shortly thereafter, detractors of the truth movement said that if there were any validity to the claims of these scientists about the World Trade Center buildings, they would be able to get papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Well, over the past year, scientists affiliated with Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice have gotten 3 papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. The lead author of the most recent of these papers, which appeared in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, is Niels Harrit, a chemistry professor at the University of Copenhagen. These scientists, who know something about the chemical constituents of the real world, report finding many elements in the World Trade Center dust that should not be there if the official theory, according to which the buildings came down solely because of the impact of the airplanes, plus the fires, plus gravity, if that were true. A few years ago, after some physicists and chemists had joined the movement, detractors said, they don't really count. The question of what brought down the World Trade Center is a question for engineers, and you don't have any. Well, that was true in 2005. The following year, however, architect Richard Gage formed Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And by now, over 650 licensed architects and engineers have signed a petition saying the official story cannot be true. There needs to be a new investigation. These architects and engineers are people who know something about that part of the real world that consists of steel frame high-rise buildings. And they know that the official story, according to which fires caused the Twin Towers and Building 7 to come straight down in virtual free fall, simply cannot be true. For example, Jack Keller, emeritus professor of engineering at Utah State University, who was recognized some years ago by Scientific American as one of our leading people in the field, has said about the collapse of Building 7, obviously it was the result of controlled demolition. A similar judgment has been offered by 2 emeritus professors of structural engineering at Zurich's Federal Institute of Technology, along with hundreds of other engineers and architects. Firefighters also have expert knowledge relevant to what happened in New York City on 9/11. And this past year brought the formation of firefighters for 9/11 Truth, who point out on the basis of their professional expertise why the NIST reports about the World Trade Center buildings should not be believed. There is also an organization called Veterans for 9/11 Truth, which includes many former military officers. They probably, I would venture to say, know a little more about the world of military affairs than does Alexander Coburn. Another professional organization with relevant expertise is Pilots for 9/11 Truth, which includes in its ranks many former commercial and military pilots who call incredible the official story about why the 9/11 airliners were not intercepted that morning. This organization has also devoted much attention to the Pentagon attack, pointing out many reasons why the official account of that attack cannot be true. The latest of the professional organizations to form is Intelligence Officers for 9/11 Truth. One of the first people to join was William Christensen, a former senior CIA official. If you are one of the many people who just knows that the alternative theory about 9/11 is not worth spending a day or two to study the evidence, listen to what he wrote in 2006. I spent the first 4.5 years since September 11th utterly unwilling to consider seriously the conspiracy theories surrounding the attacks of that day. In the last half year, and after considerable agony, I've changed my mind. I now think there is persuasive evidence that the events of September 11 did not unfold as the Bush administration and the 9/11 Commission would have us believe. The backbone of the 9/11 Truth movement is now constituted by these professional organizations of scientists, architects, engineers, firefighters, military officers, pilots, and intelligence officers. And there are still more. The past year has witnessed the formation of medical professionals for 9/11 Truth, lawyers for 9/11 Truth, religious leaders for 9/11 Truth, and very recently, political leaders for 9/11 Truth, which includes past or present members of the parliaments of Australia, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, Pakistan, and yes, Sweden, the United States, the UK, and Europe. And also a former governor of one of the states in the United States. Accordingly, people who have thought of the movement as constituted by people who can be dismissed as conspiracy nuts, even morons and idiots, need to reevaluate if they want their opinions to be based on the real world. Here is the present situation. And if you are a journalist or someone else who's going to quote one sentence from my lecture, I would suggest this one. I know it's important because it's in italics. Among independent scientists and professionals in the relevant fields who have studied the evidence, the weight of scientific and professional opinion is now overwhelmingly on the side of the 9/11 Truth movement. Whereas well over 1,000 such people have gone on record publicly, many of them at the risk of their jobs, questioning the official theory. There are virtually no scientists or professionals in the relevant fields who have gone on record in support of the official conspiracy theory, except for people who are not independent, meaning that their salaries depend upon publicly supporting the official conspiracy theory. Now, this caveat is important because, as Sinclair Lewis famously observed in 1935, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Sinclair Lewis is still alive and relevant. Except for such people, virtually everyone who has expertise in the relevant fields and who has seriously studied the evidence rejects the official conspiracy theory. It is time, therefore, for journalists and everyone else to take a second look. Journalists often say that they cannot write about an issue that is considered old news. They must have new evidence. Another reason why it is time for a second look is that there is a wealth of new evidence. My latest book is called The New Pearl Harbor Revisited. It is this thick. It is full of new evidence that has come about since 2004 when I published The New Pearl Harbor. There is so much new evidence that tonight I can only mention a tiny portion of it. Some of this new evidence has amazingly been supplied by the FBI. Although the FBI was originally the main agency creating and protecting the official account, it has recently provided several revelations that undermine that account very seriously. One example involves one of the central pillars of the official conspiracy theory, the claim that the attacks were authorized by Osama bin Laden. That claim is still used to justify the war in Afghanistan, which President Obama recently encouraged Europeans to support more wholeheartedly. But if you will go to the FBI website titled Most Wanted Terrorists and turn to its page on Osama bin Laden, you will find that although he is listed as responsible and wanted for many terrorist attacks, he is not listed as wanted for 9/11. Now, in the United States, we have a problem with the free press. It tends not to report things to us that it ought to. But surely in Sweden, it's very different here. So let me see how many people have read this fact in a local newspaper, in a local mainstream newspaper. Let's see. I'm up to 0 so far. Can we hear one? No? Okay, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. When a member of the 9/11 Truth Movement contacted the FBI to say, why don't you want Osama bin Laden for 9/11? The chief of investigative publicity at the FBI replied, because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. Now, you have, many of you for the first time tonight, picked up a copy of the Swedish translation of my book, 9/11 Contradictions. I have a whole chapter devoted simply to that point. Another example involves the reported telephone calls from the airliners, through which people on the ground were told that the planes had been hijacked by Middle Eastern terrorists. Some 15 people reported that they had been called by loved ones using mobile phones, what we in America call cell phones. United Flight 93, the plane that reportedly crashed in Pennsylvania, was by itself said to be the source of about 12 of these mobile phone calls. And one relative of a passenger, Dina Burnett, reported that she had received 3 or 4 calls from her husband, Tom Burnett, on Flight 93. And she knew that he was using his cell phone, his mobile phone, because she looked at her caller ID and she recognized his cell phone number. So there could be no doubt. But most of these calls were reportedly made when the plane was at 35,000 or even 40,000 feet. And scientists and pilots in the 9/11 Truth Movement had pointed out that the mobile phone technology of 2001 did not allow for calls to be made from high altitude airlines. Now, defenders of the official theory said, oh no, that's nonsense. Popular Mechanics said on a national television show defending their book about 9/11 that, oh, you could make mobile phone calls from 30,000, 40,000, even 50,000 feet. No problem. At the same time they were making that bravado claim, the FBI was pulling the rug out from under them. In 2006, at the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker, the FBI was required to present evidence related to 9/11. And part of this evidence was evidence about the phone calls from the 4 airliners. It's report, and you can go on the web to read about these. I've got a whole chapter about this in my book too, and you will be given the website. You can go check this out for yourself. When it comes to Flight 93, the FBI report says there were 37 calls. 35 of them were made on seatback phones, onboard phones. Only 2, they said, were made from mobile phones. And these were when the plane was just about to crash. So the airliner was at a very low altitude. So in other words, in writing that report, the FBI agreed with the 9/11 Truth Movement's claim that mobile phone calls from high-altitude airliners were impossible. But now what do we do about the fact that all these people had reported receiving calls from loved ones using mobile phones? Many of the people reported that they had been told by their husband or wife or friend that he or she was using a mobile phone. You might say, oh, well, they were mistaken, or they misremembered, or something. Well, if so, what do you do about Dina Burnett, who saw Tom's phone number, cell phone number, on her caller ID? You say, well, maybe memory was poor. She told the FBI that very day, and then she repeated it on talk shows, and she wrote it in her book. Is anybody going to accuse Dina Burnett of lying? Surely not. What motive would she have for lying? What motive would all those other people have for lying about such a matter? None. So how do we explain the fact that they all were convinced they had been called on mobile phones if the technology didn't allow it, and now the FBI report backs that up and says there were no phone calls from people at high altitudes? Well, there is a technology that can explain that. There are devices that you can buy in which you can fake any phone call you want to. You can make any phone number that you want show up on somebody's caller ID. And there's another technology known as voice morphing. And there was a report on it in 1999, 2 years before 9/11, that reported that voice morphing was now so perfected that it could fool anyone, even a spouse. So, this seriously undermines the official theory, which was based on the idea that people knew that there were hijackers on the planes because they got phone calls. Now, you might say, well, okay, maybe the mobile phone calls were impossible, but we can still believe that the people who used onboard phones really made these calls and really made these reports. But if there really were hijackers on the planes, if the hijacks were surprises, why was anyone prepared to fake the mobile phone calls? So if the mobile phone calls were faked, we must believe all the phone calls were faked. This means that the basic evidence that there were Muslim hijackers on the planes has disappeared. and the FBI has contributed to the disappearance of that. Furthermore, the FBI's report on phone calls from Flight 77 is even more devastating to the official story. The most famous of all the phone calls from the plane were two calls that were said to have been made by Barbara Olson. She was a well-known reporter on CNN. She was also the wife of Ted Olson, Theodore Olson, who was the Solicitor General for the Department of Justice. On 9/11, he told CNN that he had received 2 phone calls from his wife, Barbara, from Flight 77. This is the flight that allegedly hit the Pentagon. That each call lasted about a minute. That she reported that hijackers had taken over the plane and forced all the crew and passengers to the back of the plane, but that she was able to make these 2 phone calls to her husband. Now these were very important calls. The fact that this beloved Barbara Olson, beloved particularly by the right wing in America, that she had been killed by evil Muslims was foundational to getting the so-called war on terror started, where people were willing to give carte blanche to the military to go attack Muslims anywhere and everywhere. The call was also vital to protecting the official story about the Pentagon, because something had happened to Flight 77. It disappeared from radar in the Midwest, and there were rumors that it had crashed. Well, the calls from Barbara Olson were taken as proof that Flight 77 was still in the air, and therefore it could have been what damaged the Pentagon. So it's a very important call. Also, you all know that the hijackers had box cutters, right? You only learned that from Barbara Olson's call. None of the other reported calls mentioned box cutters. So you see how central that call was, those 2 calls were, to establishing the official myth about 9/11. But what did the FBI say when it came to its report about Flight 77? It did mention Barbara Olson, but here's what it said. It said she attempted 1 call, but this call was unconnected. And therefore it lasted, how many seconds? 0 seconds. You can go on the graphic and see that for yourself. That with all the calls, they indicated how many seconds they last. Hers lasted 0 seconds. In other words, there was no conversation between her and her husband. Now this is an astounding story, because the FBI is part of the Department of Justice. And in this report, the FBI had said that the story told to CNN and the FBI by the former Solicitor General of the Department of Justice was not true. This story that was foundational to the official story about 9/11. This report leaves only 2 choices. Either Ted Olson lied, just made it up, or he was duped, like Dina Burnett. But in either case, the official story is based on a lie. How many people would still believe the official conspiracy theory if they knew about the ways the FBI itself has contradicted the official story? How many people would believe it if they knew about the 23 other contradictions that I report in my book? Very few. So this supports my main thesis here, that insofar as people still believe the official conspiracy theory, this is only because they have been uninformed about the true facts. For my final illustration of this point, I will discuss the collapse of Building 7 of the World Trade Center. And incidentally, I have just completed a book on this report on Building 7 that will be called The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, why the final official report about 9/11 is unscientific and false. The Truth Movement has long considered the collapse of Building 7 to be the official conspiracy theory's Achilles heel, its most vulnerable spot, for several reasons. Building 7 was not hit by a plane. It had fires on only a few of its 47 floors. And it came down in virtual free fall, looking every bit like the kind of controlled demolition known as implosion, where the walls fold in upon themselves and end up as a pile of rather tidy debris. Defenders of the official story clearly did not want the public to focus on the collapse of this building for the first several years. The 9/11 Commission, in its 571-page report, could not even spare one sentence to mention the fact that this building had collapsed. So many people around the world remained ignorant of the fact. About 50% of Americans in 2006 still did not know the Building 7 had collapsed. Also, NIST delayed its report on this collapse year after year after year, saying, oh, well, we're not quite finished, we'll have it ready next year, next year, next year, finally putting it out near the end of 2008, just as Bush and Cheney were ready to leave office. My next book about this will show that this report inadvertently reveals that a plausible defense of the official theory about this building, according to which it was brought down by fire alone, is impossible to defend coherently. To attempt this defense, NIST had to ignore various kinds of physical evidence in the World Trade Center. And ignoring relevant evidence is one of the categories of scientific fraud. What kind of evidence did they ignore? Well, the physical evidence in the World Trade Center dust, such as the existence of particles that could have been formed only at extremely high temperatures, in some cases 3 times higher than the temperature that fire could have possibly produced. The dust also includes elements that seem explainable only as the residue of nanothermite, which is a high explosive. Thermite has been around for over 100 years, but nanothermite is a rather new invention, and it is qualitatively different. Ordinary thermite is just an incendiary. It causes fires. Nanothermite is a high explosive, very, very powerful. The dust even includes active thermitic material discovered by physicist Stephen Jones, which appears to be unreacted nanothermite. This is the conclusion of the new paper, which I mentioned earlier, for which the lead author is Copenhagen's Niels Harrit, who is an expert in nanochemistry. When NIST was asked whether it had checked the dust for evidence of thermite, it said no. When a reporter asked Michael Newman, a NIST spokesman, why not, Newman replied, because there was no evidence of that. This circular answer led the reporter to ask, but how can you know there's no evidence if you don't look for it first? Newman replied, if you're looking for something that isn't there, you're wasting your time and the taxpayers' money. This is the quality of defense that is capable of being given for the official theory. I'm not making this stuff up. It's really that bad. NIST also ignored and distorted testimonial evidence that explosions had gone off in Building 7. The most important such testimony was given by Barry Jennings of the New York City Housing Authority. As soon as the North Tower was struck that morning at 8:46, Jennings rushed, as he was supposed to do, to the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7, where Mayor Giuliani had his Office of Emergency Management. But when he got there, along with Michael Hess, who was Giuliani's lead attorney, his corporation counsel, they found that everyone had already left, and they had left suddenly. The coffee cups were still steaming. There were half-eaten sandwiches on the desks. Calling to ask what they should do, they were told, "You should get out of the building, and get out of the building fast." They tried to go down the elevator. It would not work, so they started running down the stairs as fast as they could go. But when they got to the 6th floor, Jennings said the landing was blown out from under them by a huge explosion from beneath. That he was barely able to hold on, pulled himself up, went back up to the 8th floor, broke a window, and started calling for help. When he looked out the windows, he said, "I looked one way, the other way, the Twin Towers were still standing." And of course they were. This was 9:15. And the South Tower did not collapse until 9:59, almost 10 o'clock. However, when Giuliani wrote a book in 2002 and reported on the 9/11 experiences of his good friend Michael Hess, he claimed that this event that they called an explosion was just debris hitting the building from the collapse of the North Tower. But the North Tower didn't collapse until 10:28, almost 10:30. So this was about an hour and a quarter later than the event that Hess and Jennings had reported. But this became the official story. It was defended by NIST in 2005 when it put out its report on the Twin Towers, and then in 2008 by the BBC in a special on World Trade Center 7. The BBC, which used to be a great organization, but now has become one of the main supporters of the Bush-Cheney conspiracy theory about 9/11. Jennings had told his story in an interview for the producers of Loose Change Final Cut. And I happen to be the script consultant for that film, so I know something about the inside story. Jennings, after he had given the interview, then begged them not to include it because he feared that he would lose his job. They agreed and left the interview out. But later, Jennings then gave an interview to the BBC. He told the same story, but the BBC left out the parts where he mentioned the times, and they put his story within their framework, and therefore made it appear to be the big explosion, to be, as the British narrator put it, just debris from a falling skyscraper. The BBC even made it seem as if Jennings had been all by himself, even though he reportedly said, "We did this and we did that." They made it appear that he had been all by himself. This BBC program aired in July of 2008. NIST, whose timeline the BBC had followed, released the first draft of its report on Building 7 the following month, August of 2008. Shortly before this release, evidently only 2 days before the release of this report, Barry Jennings, who was 53 years old, died mysteriously. And I say mysteriously because every attempt by members of the 9/11 Truth Movement to find out why Jennings died, how he died, where he died, we can get no answers whatsoever. A complete blackout. The only information that was given was that he evidently died in a hospital. Whatever the cause of his death, it was certainly convenient. He was not around to be interviewed again, perhaps by the producers of Loose Change Final Cut. And the BBC was able to put out a new version of its special on Building 7, this time including Michael Hess, who in the intervening years had not uttered a word publicly about what happened on 9/11. But now he suddenly spoke freely. And he supported the BBC's timeline. Another relevant fact about Michael Hess is, besides the fact that he was Giuliani's good friend and former corporation counsel, since 2002, he had been the vice chairman of Giuliani's consulting business. So the BBC pushed him out there and said, conspiracy theorists have charged us with distorting the timeline. But Michael Hess, who was there, confirms our timeline, as if Michael Hess were an impartial witness. To see the falsity of that timeline, one only needs to look at the interview of Jennings by the Loose Change producers, which is now on the internet, and you can watch it. Look for Barry Jennings Uncut. The timely and mysterious death of Jennings, moreover, may well indicate just how threatening the truth about Building 7 is to the official conspiracy theory about 9/11. In any case, I will point out one more way in which Building 7 has proved to be the Achilles heel of the Bush-Cheney administration's conspiracy theory about 9/11. I mentioned earlier that Building 7 came down in virtual freefall. In the first draft of its report, the one that it put out in August of 2008, NIST claimed that the collapse took far longer than would freefall. It also explained why, given its theory, which is the theory of progressive collapse, absolute freefall would have been impossible. They explained there's all that concrete, there's all that steel, 82 steel columns. The top part of the building could not just come down through all of that as if it weren't there. Absolute freefall means if you had dropped a brick off the top of World Trade Center 7, at the same time the building started to collapse, the brick would have gone at the same speed as the roof line of the building. And the BBC said that would have been impossible. However, a high school physics teacher named David Chandler produced a video showing that the building did come down in absolute freefall for over 2 seconds. Not only did he put this on the internet, he confronted NIST in a public session that was broadcast live. So they couldn't cover it up. So when NIST put out its final report in November of 2008, it did an amazing thing. It admitted that the building came down in absolute freefall. This means at the acceleration of gravity for 2.25 seconds, 2.25 seconds. And in this world, that is a very, very long time. But it did not change its theory. It still had a theory of progressive collapse, which rules out absolute freefall. So you have an absolute contradiction between NIST's theory about Building 7 and its admission of the empirical fact of 2.25 seconds of absolute freefall. This contradiction can well be seen as the ultimate self-destruction of the official conspiracy theory about what happened in New York City on 9/11, which says that Muslim terrorists brought down 3 buildings by flying planes into 2 of them. I will conclude by addressing members of the 9/11 Truth movement both old members and any new members that may have been created tonight. As you see, I'm an optimist. Reason will out. Rather than letting up on our efforts to get the truth about 9/11 revealed, it is now time to work even harder. One reason is that there has been an important cultural shift that has occurred, at least in the United States. It is now more possible to suggest, in polite company, that 9/11 was an inside job. As evidence for this, I point to my 2008 book, New Pearl Harbor Revisited. My first book, New Pearl Harbor, when it came out in 2004, it was ridiculed by Publishers Weekly. Publishers Weekly is really the Bible in North America for booksellers and librarians. It tells them of the thousands of books published every month, which ones are worth buying. They said, oh, conspiracy theorists will love this, but other people will realize it's absurd. When I published my second book, 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, which pointed out over 100 lies of omission and distortion in the Commission Report, they said essentially the same thing. This is ridiculous conspiracy theory. But in 2008, the third week of November, they named New Pearl Harbor Revisited as the pick of the week. This is an honor that is given to only 51 books each year. So that is a very remarkable statement. Now, I say that not just to brag, but that too. But to point out, this is a remarkable shift. In 2004, 2005, 2006, it would not have been acceptable for a prestigious organization like Publishers Weekly that relies on its reputation to have said that a book that accuses the Bush-Cheney administration of orchestrating 9/11 is a good book, and in fact one of the best books of the year. They couldn't have said that. But something has happened, that in 2008, they surely got together and talked about this and said, do we dare do this? We agree this is a great book, but can we say that in public? Will it destroy our reputation? I don't know what went on, but whatever happened, they said it. They said it publicly. So that suggests the fear is starting to dissipate in the United States. Maybe it will start to dissipate in Sweden too, pretty soon. So, this shift will continue to grow, this change of attitude, as people become aware of the facts I've reported tonight, particularly the creation of all these organizations. You know, most people don't have time to study the evidence, so they rely on authority. So they have assumed that the authorities support the official story. But now when they realize that pilots who've studied the official account reject it, that architects and engineers, pretty soon it'll be 1,000 of them who've signed this document, and intelligence officers and military officers and firefighters, and that many of the leading religious thinkers in America and medical professionals, and pretty soon there's going to be an organization of media professionals for 9/11 Truth, which I hope some of you can join. When people realize this shift has occurred and that very few people in the relevant fields and the relevant sciences support the official story, and all of those have their salaries dependent upon supporting it, there will be a giant shift that occurs in the general population. And maybe pretty soon the politicians and newspapers and TV networks will follow suit. So there is a possibility now, for the first time, that we might get a new investigation. So I say, this is not a time to give up. This is a time to work even harder. And so that we can finally get the truth about 9/11 revealed, so that, and this is the important thing, so that all of the 9/11 based policies, all the restrictions on civil rights within Europe as well as North America, all the wars, all the prejudice against Muslims as the religion that attacked America on 9/11. So all of those things can finally be reversed. So let me mention especially political leaders for 9/11 truth. We need to get leaders at every level. It doesn't have to be just senators and people at the national level. People at the provincial level, people at the municipal level, the local level. It's open to political leaders of all levels. So most of you know people of that sort. Try to educate them about 9/11 and get them to join in on this, so that people in Europe can put pressure, political leaders in Europe can put pressure on the Obama administration to institute a genuine investigation into 9/11. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Griffin. It was really, I'm so proud to be your publisher, and I hope that as people are waking up in America, people will also start waking up in Sweden and all over the world, because this is really a question of the future, of everybody's future. Now, we still have 1 hour and 15 minutes to go. That's wonderful, I think, to have Professor Griffin's company for another at least 1 hour. And we will go over to see another truther, Professor Niels Harrit, who has been interviewed on the Danish television, on the news, which is really amazing when you think about it. It's hardly any country's television, the news has interviewed somebody about the subject and giving them such a long time. It's a 10 minutes interview without trying to ridicule them or make fun of them or so. So this is really a big event which we should use to the maximum and show that there are some really serious people behind this movement. It's not, as they call us, amateurs, amatörforskare, as it was written today in the newspaper. It's serious people behind this, and we will follow it to the end.
We must read the signs. We must read the signs. We must read the signs. We gotta read the signs.
Dødstallet er foreløbig nået op på 150, mens 1500 er meldt kvæstet. Internationale forskere har fundet spor af sprængstoffer i ruinerne af World Trade Center. I en ny videnskabelig artikel får det forskerne til at konkludere, at det formentlig ikke var sammenstødende med de 2 kaprede fly, der i 2001 fik World Trade-tårnene til at kollapse. Så vender vi blikket imod 9/11, det store angreb i New York. Det var nemlig formentlig ikke sammenstødet med de 2 kaprede fly, der i 2001 fik de 2 tvillingetårne til at kollapse. Det konkluderer i hvert fald en netop offentliggjort videnskabelig artikel. Internationale forskere har gjort fund af sprængstoffet nanotermit i ruinerne af de sammenstyrtede tårne, og sprængstoffet kan ikke stamme fra de 2 fly. Tværtimod tyder undersøgelserne på, at det formentlig i forvejen var anbragt i bygningerne, og der er altså tale om flere tons sprængstof. Niels Harrit, du har sammen med 8 andre forskere lavet den her artikel, hvor I konkluderer, at det formentlig var stoffet nanotermit, som forårsagede sammenstyrtningerne i de her bygninger. Hvad er nanotermit for en størrelse?
At vi har fundet nanotermit i støvet fra sammenstyrtning af World Trade Center. Vi siger ikke, at der kun blev brugt nanotermit. Men nanotermit, hvis jeg skal forklare, hvad det er, så den sidste del af ordet termit, det er en gammel opfindelse faktisk fra 1893, som er en blanding af aluminium og pulveriseret rust, som hvis det reagerer med hinanden, udvikler en enorm varme. Der dannes i reaktionen jern, som er 2.500 grader varmt, og det kan man bruge til at svejse med, det har man gjort, det er meget nyttigt, men det kan også bruges til at smelte andet jern. Men i nanoteknologien, der bliver alting meget mindre. Så de her to pulver, som man lavede i 1893, er nu om dagen nogle bitte små partikler, som er blandet umådeligt godt med hinanden. Og det betyder, at når de reagerer, så udvikles denne her enorme varme meget, meget hurtigere. Og samtidig kan man tilsætte andre stoffer, således at nanotermitter både kan virke som noget, der giver en masse varme, men det kan også virke som et meget, meget effektivt sprængstof. Faktisk er der mere energi i nanotermitter, end der er i almindelige sprængstoffer og dynamit. Og man kan også bruge det som raketsprængstof, så det kan bruges til det hele.
Jeg var inde og google på nanotermit, og der er faktisk ikke skrevet så forfærdeligt meget om det. Er det et bredt anerkendt videnskabeligt stof, som man opererer med, eller er det så nyt, at det er næsten ukendt for mange andre fagfolk?
Altså, det er en samlet betegnelse for en masse materialer, energetiske materialer, der har energi. Og hvis der ikke er så mange, der kender det, så skyldes det måske, at civile forskere, som jeg, ikke beskæftiger sig normalt med sprængstoffer til hverdag. Og med hensyn til mine kolleger inden for det militære forskningsapparat, så må du hellere spørge dem, fordi jeg ved jo ikke, hvor meget de er på forkant med nanoteknologi.
Men altså, I har fundet det her stof i World Trade Center, og hvorfor mener I, at det har fået bygningerne til at kollapse?
Ja, det er jo sprængstof, og hvorfor skulle det ellers være der? Men
det er varmeudviklingen, I mener, der simpelthen har smeltet stålkonstruktionerne, som jo ellers skulle kunne holde bygningerne oppe, at det er i virkeligheden det, der har fået bygningerne til at kollapse som korthus?
Ja, hvis jeg skal svare på det helt præcist, så ved vi det ikke endnu. Fordi det materiale, vi har fundet, har mulighed for både at fungere som sprængstof, som altså direkte slår tingene over, og det har mulighed for at smelte stålet. Sandsynligvis er der brugt begge slags. Altså det er min egen opfattelse af det, at der er en lang periode inden tårnene styrter sammen, hvor det for eksempel vælter med smeltet metal ud af det sydlige tårn flere minutter inden. Og det er et tegn på, at der er en proces inden selve sammenstyrtning, hvor man har svækket hele strukturen. Og så kommer der mere konventionelle, regulære sprængstoffer ind til de der. Selve sammenstyrtningssekvensen skal være enormt godt synkroniseret. Altså, det er jo en hel række sprængninger, som man kan se hele vejen ned, når tårnene styrter sammen.
Hvor store mængder taler man om? Hvor meget skal der til?
Det er meget, fordi der var 3 skyskraber. Skal vi lige få det ind? Der var 3 skyskraber, men der var 2 flyvemaskiner. Og vi har jo selvfølgelig en nogenlunde fornemmelse af, hvor meget støv, der er blevet dannet. Og det kan man se på alle mulige billeder. Der er enorme støvmængder, som der kom. Alt blev pulveriseret, undtagen af selve jernskelettet. Og vi ved nogenlunde, hvor meget rester vi har fundet af ureageret termit. Det er the loaded gun, det her. Det er ikke det, der er blevet brugt. Det er det, der af en eller anden grund ikke har reageret. Og så vi snakker om tons, vi snakker om over 10 tons, måske 100 tons.
10 tons, 100 tons i 3 bygninger?
Ja.
Og vi taler altså ikke om materiale, som normalt indgår i bygninger af skyskraber?
Nej. Det er super avanceret materiale, det her.
Men hvordan placerer man sådan noget i skyskraber på alle etagerne? Altså
hvordan man får det ind?
Ja.
På paller. Ja, det vil jeg da. Altså, hvis jeg skulle transportere de mængder, ville jeg da køre det ind på paller. Hvordan en lastbil, og så køre det ind på paller.
Hvorfor har man ikke opdaget det noget før? Eller før?
Hvem skulle opdage det?
Portneren for eksempel, altså at man kører rundt med 10-100 tons nanotermit, som man placerer på etagerne i store sække, eller jeg ved ikke, hvad man gør. Altså, det undrer mig bare, at man ikke har opdaget det.
Jamen, det spørgsmål skal du jo som journalist stille til det firma, som stod for kontrollen, for sikkerhedskontrollen i World Trade Center.
Men I er i hvert fald ikke i tvivl om, at materialet har været der?
Ja, det er sådan videnskab. Du kan ikke rigtig snyde der, at vi har fundet det. Og det er ureageret tamil. Ikke?
Hvilken modtagelse har jeres artikel fået rundt omkring i verden? Altså det er jo helt ny viden for mig også.
Ja. Nu udkom den altså i fredags, så det kan vi ikke rigtig sige endnu. Men der er ikke så stor nyhedsværdi i det her, som du måske tror. Fordi at de 3 skyskrabere blev revet ned, det er der 100.000 vis af mennesker over hele verden, der ved. Fordi det har været krystalklart længe af mange andre grunde, end jeg kommer med her. Det her, det er kun det sidste søm i kisten. Altså, fordi, som sagt, det er ikke the smoking gun, det her, det er the loaded gun. Og antallet af mennesker, som indser, at World Trade Center blev revet ned, de vokser med tusindvis om dagen. Det er ikke noget, du bare sådan kan stoppe, så det skal nok komme.
Hvordan kan det være, at man ikke har opdaget, at der har været nanotermit i bygningerne tidligere? Altså, vi har jo snart 10-års jubilæum på terrorangrebet, og det kan jo egentlig undre, at man ikke har fundet det tidligere.
Altså i støvet, mener du?
Ja.
Det blev fordi det er lidt tilfældigt, at der var så en, der kiggede på støvet i et mikroskop, og det er sådan nogle små røde chips. Altså de største er 1 millimeter og ned efter. Så de allerstørste kan du se med det blotte øje, men langt de fleste af dem skal du altså have et mikroskop frem for at finde. Og så det var lidt et tilfælde. Det er lidt over 2 år siden, at der var en, der opdagede det. Og den videnskabelige artikel, som du refererer til her, og som udkom i fredags, den har været 1,5 år undervejs. Det er en meget omfattende artikel, det er meget grundigt arbejde, og det laver man ikke fra den ene dag til den anden.
Men du har arbejdet i flere år, fordi det her, det har undret dig?
Ja, over 2 år faktisk. Det var da jeg så bygning 7, som er den 3. skyskraber, styrte sammen. Da jeg så den første gang, fordi den styrtede ned 7 timer efter tårnene, og der var altså kun 2 flyvemaskiner. Så når man ser sådan en bygning på 47 etager, 186 meter høj, styrte sammen på 6,5 sekunder, og man er naturvidenskabsmand, så tænker man, what? Og så skal man lige se det igen, og så skulle jeg se det igen, og så trykkede jeg på knappen 10 gange, og munden røg længere og længere ned, fordi for det første havde jeg aldrig hørt om den bygning før, for det andet var der ikke nogen synlig grund til, at den skulle styre sammen på den måde. Den styrter fuldstændig sammen, så der siger den sådan på 6,5 sekunder. Og siden den dag har jeg ikke haft fri.
Altså, lige siden 9/11, der har der jo været spekulationer fremme og konspirationsteorier. Og hvad vil du sige til de seere, som nu sidder og hører om jeres undersøgelse for første gang, og hører om jeres videnskabelige arbejde og siger, ja, vi har hørt det før, måske i anden indpakning. Folk har god fantasi, der er masser af konspirationsteorier. Hvad vil du sige til dem, for at overbevise dem om, at det her, det er altså noget andet?
For mig er der kun én konspirationsteori, som er værd at snakke om her. Og det er den med de 19 flykapere. Og der synes jeg, at de mennesker, som der så sidder, som kigger på det her, skal spørge sig selv, om hvilke beviser har vi egentlig set på den konspirationsteori, den officielle konspirationsteori. Har vi set nogle beviser? Hvis der er nogen, der har set dem, så vil jeg gerne høre om dem. Der er ikke nogen, der er anklaget. Der er ikke nogen, der er efterlyst. Så det eneste konsekvens af det her, mener jeg, må være et krav om at få en ordentlig politimæssig efterforskning af terrorangrebet 9/11, fordi det er ikke sket. Den venter vi på, og vi håber, at vores resultater vil indgå som tekniske beviser, når den dag kommer.
Niels Heidt, spændende. Tak fordi du kom.
Selv tak.
In the end of the speech, we were addressing Obama and that we should ask him for an investigation. Why Obama? He will cover up his masters, the Brzezinski, Rockefellers and Rothschild. The real criminal is a worldwide network who promote the lie, and more importantly, the agenda of the New World Order. Obama is a part of it. Why grovel to him and his global carbon scam? So throw the trash out, all of it.
For those of you who are confused, the written document, in the written document, that version of the speech, I did talk about Obama. I didn't talk about Obama in the lecture tonight because I wanted to talk about 9/11. So that's the situation.
Greetings. In relation to the cell phone calls, in particular the two Barbara Olson calls, this wasn't mentioned.
Why don't you pull the mic up so it faces your mouth?
I've read that airphones, not cell phones, but airphones, were not on the Boeing airplanes of the model that we use. Anyhow, is that correct?
From all we could determine, the Boeing 757s that were made for American Airlines, as distinct from the Boeing 757s that were made for United Airlines, did not have airphones. And so I had discussed this issue in my 2006 book, the one I wrote in 2006, debunking, in English was called Debunking 9/11 Debunking. And in fact, I put out a second edition of it just to focus on this because we found the new information, which was that a 9/11 truth scholar in Germany had written to American Airlines and said, I understand that your Boeing 757s did not have onboard phones. So, how were these calls made? And the customer service representative wrote back and said, that's true. Our Boeing 757s do not have and did not have onboard phones. And so therefore the people who made outcalls had to use their cell phones. And then that brings us back to the problem, were mobile phones or cell phone calls possible? The story was even more complex because Ted Olson went back and forth. First he said she called on a cell phone, then he changed it to a seat-back phone, and then he went back to cell phone. And so there were lots of issues around this. So the final word we got was that no, they did not have airphones. And now the FBI is saying no high-altitude cell phone calls were made. And so we get the FBI's conclusion, Barbara Olson didn't make any calls. In a way that is kind of out of date, because for the same reason I said to the other gentleman, now the FBI itself has said these calls didn't occur. Whether they were aware that the Boeing 757s made for American didn't have onboard phones, I don't know. They seem to write their report as if they did. So it's a very complicated mess. The bottom line of which is this is one more or set of facts that shows the official story is a lie. Thank you.
Professor, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for your bravery in presenting what you have been doing over the years. I've read many of your articles about 9/11 and other things. And I can personally testify to the fact that cell phones didn't work on the airplanes because less than a week after the very first planes that took to the skies, I took a plane from Vegas to California, and I was trying to use my cell phone. Against regulations, of course, but I was trying to use my cell phone, and there was no way a signal got through. And that plane doesn't even go as high as 35,000 because as soon as the plane goes up, it's on its way down. And so it couldn't have been any more than 17,000, 18,000 feet. And the phone would not give a signal at all. For me, looking at it on a very logical and psychological level, the thing that doesn't match up with 9/11 is that here you have the most expensive and the most sophisticated security apparatus ever created by human beings in the United States. And it all failed. And nobody even got mad at the people that caused it to fail. Nobody got mad. Condoleezza Rice, as head of security of the United States of America, should have been fired immediately and investigated if there was something genuine. If I were president, if any one of you were president, and this happened on your watch, the first thing you would say is, how the hell did this happen? You're fired. You're head of security.
You got promotions instead.
You're fired, okay? Instead, they all got promoted. Every damn one of them got promoted. The only people who didn't get promoted, who got fired, were those who said, excuse me, boss. Something's wrong here. You're fired. That's my point.
By the way, just a footnote to the first part of your comment. This was discussed at great length on Pilots for 9/11 Truth, and dozens of people have reported your experience, that they also tried to use their phones surreptitiously and couldn't do it. Most people reported that at least by 1,000 feet the phone went out. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Griffin, can you please tell us a bit more about your two upcoming books on 9/11? Thank you.
You think that was a planted question, don't you? It wasn't.
We've never met.
The next one, which is a little, what Chaucer called a little book. When after he wrote a book, he would send it off and he'd say, "Go, little book, go." This will be a little book. It was originally going to be a long internet article, and somebody said, well, why not make it a little book? And I asked my publisher, and they said, sure. It will be called Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. And the argument, voting.
December 2001.
And he seems to have died on December 13th or 14th. December of 2001, one little hint being the funeral announcement on December 15th. And another little hint being that up till then, the CIA was intercepting his phone calls regularly, and they all stopped on December 13th. There's not been a peep out of bin Laden or to bin Laden since December 13th. So then I go through, and then the big question is, well, what about all these audio tapes and videotapes from Osama bin Laden? Well, that means somebody's fabricating these.
You're here.
And the best giveaway to this is the one that I like to call Blackbeard the Terrorist. Because his beard had been getting grayer and grayer, and then all of a sudden he's got a completely black beard. Well, anyway, so that one is just directed to the Obama administration insofar as they've said, well, we've got to get out of Iraq and go into Afghanistan and finally get Osama bin Laden and the people who attacked us on 9/11. So this one is not a 9/11 book in the sense that it doesn't argue 9/11 was an inside job. It just argues that we can't use Osama bin Laden as an excuse to keep fighting in Afghanistan if he's been dead all these years. The other book is the one that I mentioned, Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7. And I've been very encouraged by the responses from several scientists that I've sent it to for critique. And they are quite pleased with it, and one is so pleased that he's trying to raise money to send it to every scientist in the United States. That'd be a lot of money. But somehow to get the scientific community aware of the huge and abundant lies told in this report. Let me just give one example. I've
mention the fact that they ignore all sorts of evidence about explosives and stuff in the dust and testimonies. That's one category of fraud. Another category of fraud is fabrication of evidence and falsification of evidence. They develop their own theory, and the theory has to do involving shear studs. These are these big bolts or screws that hold things to the floor slabs, and they argue that the reason the building came down is because the girders didn't have these shear studs, and that enabled them to be pushed off, and then that led to this, and that led to that, and that led to column 81 falling, and then column 81 falling caused all the other 81 columns to fall. And it's all because the girders didn't have shear studs. You look back in the 2004 report that NIST itself put out, called the Interim Report on World Trade Center 7, and it says, the beams and the girders were connected to the floor slabs with shear studs. In the new document, they just leave the statement "and girders" out and just say the beams were connected to the floors with shear studs, but the girders were not. So that's one huge lie. Another lie, another fabrication, is they say the theory is the building came down because of thermal expansion. And it was that the floor beams expanded so much, they went over there and knocked column 81 off of its pedestal. And that's what caused the building to come down. Now, how was it that the beams went over there? Well, because they were connected to the floor with shear studs. So how did they expand? Well, because they broke the shear studs, and then they were free to expand wildly. How could they break the shear studs? The shear studs and the concrete, they said it was thermal differential expansion. So they're claiming that the steel beam expanded under the heat of the fire, but the concrete didn't expand. Now, just a minute. You know about reinforced concrete. You put steel bars inside the concrete, and it works in very hot weather, it works in very cold weather. That's because the differential expansion rate of steel and concrete is virtually identical. So why would the steel have expanded and not the concrete? Well, there's one little sentence in there, and they say, and see, everything they do in a computer simulation. They don't deal with the real building. They make up a computer simulation in which they feed data in, and then that predicts this would happen, this would happen. And they say, in the simulation, we didn't heat the floor slab. So in the real building, the fire would have heated the floor slab and the steel beams simultaneously. But when they're doing the simulation, they don't heat this is incredible. This is scientific fraud of absurd proportions. And this is the official report on why. And yet Sunder comes in, the head of the NIST team that did this, and he comes in August to the press conference and says, the mystery of World Trade Center 7 has been solved. Solved only because they commit this kind of fraud. And let me just give one more example. The whole idea is there were these giant fires going, and they were just getting hotter and hotter up till 5:20. It just caused the building to come down. And the biggest fires were on floor 11, 12, and 13, and particularly floor 12. And they give you graphics in which they show you these huge fires burning at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Go back to the interim report, World Trade Center 7, and you look, and there's a picture. And then the subtitle says, by 4:45, the fires on floor 12 had completely gone out. And yet, in their new report, they tell us that at 5 o'clock, 4/12 was a scene of raging inferno. It was just huge fires all over the place, contradicting their previous report. This is massive scientific fraud. So I'm hoping Obama will be, so I will say something about Obama. He has committed himself that his administration will base its policies on good intelligence and good science. And if he holds to his word, he will have to, first of all, get rid of everybody at NIST who was involved in this and tell the American people that this report was a giant fraud, which would imply, therefore, that 9/11 was an inside job. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation, and thank you all here at Alhambra also. My name is Michael, and I'm responsible for the homepage vaken.se. On that homepage you will be able to download this lecture free of cost, of course. And to my question, I can see a little bit a risk in this 9/11 truth movement, that some people are really into just looking at the 9/11 issue, and I can see a risk with the politicians now, like Obama. Maybe he will turn around and give the blame to the Bush administration. But the risk here is that this will end all this discussion about conspiracy theories and just continue with business as usual, as has been done so many times before. Myself and us at Vaken.se, we're very much into looking at all different aspects of reality and different conspiracies or different social issues like global warming, etc. What are your thoughts about that?
Okay, I have given primary attention to 9/11 because it's sort of the granddaddy of all of these, and it was the one that provided the basis for these others. So I will be quite pleased if we get 9/11 exposed. That'll be big. The significance will be overwhelming. But secondly, I think it will work the other way. If this one gets exposed, be more likely that the others will be exposed, as people will say, well, if the United States did it, probably our own government did it too. So I think it'll work that way. Thank you.
My question is that it's not true that the reason this is being stifled at every level, you talked about the municipal level, the provincial level, the state level, the national level, the international level. A question was asked by the second person up here tonight. Is it not true? The reason we can't get the truth out is because, as you said yourself, Dr. Griffin, it's very hard to get a man whose paycheck is dependent on the truth getting out to see the truth. And the second question was, doesn't this start at a family called the Rothschilds, together with the Illuminati?
Yes. Yes.
Excuse me, say my question, and he may answer. I want to hear the answer, sir. Please. Does it not start with a family named the Rothschilds, 6 generations worth, with the Illuminati, which have been romanticized in the new movie with Tom Hanks, which I'm sure we're all going to see. And then it goes down with Zionism and Freemasons and neocons. And then we get down to our governments in all nations. Doesn't matter whether they're Italian, Swedish, Canadian, American. And that the reason we can't get the truth out is because the people that have control of the purse strings don't want it to come out. And I'm not sure what it's going to take to get the world to see the truth, to understand the truth that you've been saying for, 6 years? 5 years? Fantastically, in 7 books, very clearly. As long as people like Obama, who has a Zionist in principle cabinet with him, and in England it's exactly the same thing. The BBC is, as you said yourself, is no longer a legitimate channel because they're also a propaganda channel. We have spin and fluff. People like you that take your time to come to Sweden and speak the truth You're not going to be on the front page of any of the papers in this country because they're also run by the same people. That's my question.
Thank you. On the first point, you lifted up me and Richard Gage and Stephen Jones, and certainly those two or those three of us have played a major role, but I wouldn't say that it's qualitatively different from the role that many other people have played. So it's been a very large movement with a large number of leaders. For example, I would lift up Giulietta Chiesa, whose film Zero has been seen by 40 or 50 or 60 million people by now who've come to awareness. The people who started Pilots for 9/11 Truth, Veterans for 9/11 Truth, firefighters for 9/11 Truth. So there aren't just a handful. There's a lot of people. And so it's a very big movement with lots of people exerting intellectual leadership, as well as those then who have exerted the more activistic kind of leadership. That said, my only problem with what you said in the second part is that it quite well is true. That is that the people with the purse strings don't want it to come out and therefore will not let it come out. I think the details of it, the names you mentioned, I have not gone into, I know these names, I have not gone into study them enough to be able to speak definitively on it. I found that just working at the level that I've been working on, which is focusing on the multiple forms of evidence that the official story is false, has been a full-time job. I've sometimes say it's been 9/11 24/7 since 2003. That's an exaggeration. It's only been 9/11 about 14/7. I only work about 14 hours a day on it. And that hasn't left me a whole lot of time to deal with the higher level of who was behind it, what their motives were, and all that. I know other people are working on that, but there has to be a distribution of labor. But the more general point you make is that it's the global the American and global plutocracy that's behind this, and that's why we can't get any media coverage. I recently got a report from someone who said that a few years ago they were talking with reporters at Fox News. Now, Fox News is the most right-wing reactionary network in the United States, but these Fox News reporters say, we know this, we know of an inside job, but our executives won't let us report it. So don't blame the reporters. For the most part, they can't do. And if they try, they lose their job, and to what avail. But on the other hand, we do hope there will be some courage and the people will take the risk and say, you know, maybe saving the planet is a little more important than my keeping my paycheck, and would somehow surreptitiously get something reported that could make a difference. So there is always this opportunity for acts of bravery, and I hope that some of them will come from people in the media. So where does that leave us? Why do I keep at it, given the fact that odds are huge against it? Because it is not impossible. The odds are large against it, but I wouldn't say we have a zero chance. I would say that as long as Bush and Cheney were in office, we had zero chance. But the change now, we don't know. Now, there are some people who speak with great confidence about what they know about Obama, that he's a puppet. I don't know how these people know this unless they're mind readers. So I think we need to go on the assumption that he is operating in good faith. And until we know otherwise, what other choice do we have? So let's take him at his word that he's going to base his policies on good intelligence and good science, and keep pointing out that good intelligence and good science dictate the opposite conclusion from what he's been operating on thus far. And I've learned some things on this tour where I was saying at the beginning of the tour, I think now we have a 5% chance of real investigation, whereas before we had 0. I've learned some new things that make me think now it's maybe up to 15% or so. Things I'm not at liberty to talk about, but that have given me more hope and will certainly keep me going for quite a while longer. So that's the best I can do with a very difficult question.
Yes, my name is Jan Fjellander, and first I want to thank you for your work, and I also want to congratulate Alhambra for this initiative, very courageous of you. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, on the opposite, I'm trying to work against it. I've experience of what conspiracy theories can lead to in a political sense, being an activist in the last 40, 45 years. And I've seen lots of negative things about that. And I'm very trying to stand away from it. But I must say that with regard to 9/11, for the last 2 years, I have had an increasing, bigger and bigger fight within myself that I cannot lie to facts. So thank you for your work. Many other things that I've been struck have come from you. I'd like you to enlighten two things, which I think keeps to the larger picture of this whole story. Can you tell us what is the present status of the list of 19 so-called terrorists? That's my first question. The second question is, what can you tell us about the comment on the film that we saw, that the journalists should ask those who were in charge of the security of the World Trade Center? These two things are very, very interesting. Then I have two quick questions.
I'm afraid we won't have time. We have to
Okay. On the hijackers, I'll have to refer you to the new Pearl Harbor Revisited, where I discuss that quite a bit. And I'm hoping that may be the next book that would be translated into Swedish. And if some of you have means to encourage Alhambra to make another translation, then it might come about. And I think I know you know what I mean. But just very briefly, there clearly were people who were accused of being hijackers who were still alive after 9/11. The clearest case is Walid al-Shehri, who was accused of being one of the ones on Flight 11. He and his brother Wael al-Shehri were even accused of being the ones who stabbed the flight attendants and killed them. That is straight up. Well, he showed up a few days after 9/11 and said, I didn't die.